Hello, I am Angus Watson and I am an author. I'm going to read to you today from my book Land You Never Leave, the middle book of the West of West trilogy, which begins with You Die When You Die. I'm going to be looking over here quite a lot because that's where everything is written down. I'm going to try and do it in one take, so there may well be children running in, cats jumping on me, that kind of thing. And if I stumble over words, I will repeat them. Sorry about that. I will try not to mumble because I do tend to do that. There are junior level swear words in this family friendly section, but it gets a bit gory at the end, but I would rate it a PG. But I am a very, very lax rater. So West of West tells the epic saga of a mismatched group of Vikings crossing a fantasy North America on a quest 1,000 years ago. They are attacked by animals, ever nastier and weirder monsters, other people, each other, and nature itself. Tornadoes, avalanches, flash floods, fire-nados, that sort of thing. To make matters trickier, they're also pursued by a squad of magic-powered warriors who are bent on their destruction. Despite the grimdarky covers, West of West is really a humorous, character-driven adventure. Please do have a look at reviews, which are generally good. Most reviews say, I can't believe more people aren't reading this series. So please can all of you read the series so reviewers have something else to write about. I'm reading this section that follows, it's bang in the middle of the trilogy, but it's kind of a standalone. Yarg Lobster, who's the star of this bit, only appears in this bit. It does contain the spoiler that the Calnians attack the Badlands, but I reckon you'll forget that by the time I've finished this sentence and the reading. Okay, so here we go. Yarg Lobster ran towards the Badlands in the front rank of the attack, tossing his spear from one hand to the other every 20 paces to prevent either arm becoming fatigued. He told the others to do the same, but had they listened to him? Had they, bunnies? They were jogging along with their spears always in the same hand, so they were going to reach the fight with tired spear arms. Idiots. Worse, some of them had chosen hand axes instead of spears, attacking an enemy up a hill with an axe. What the bunnies was the thinking behind that? There was no thinking, and that was the problem. For the love of Inowak, it was enough to make you weep. The trouble with getting older, Yarg had realised a while back, was that it became clearer and clearer that everyone but him was an absolute moron. When Yarg saw a problem, he saw a solution. And when did he start working on that problem? I think we'll leave that. When did he start working on that solution? Right away, of course. I was trying to turn the sound off. Okay, so when Yarg saw a problem, he saw a solution. And when did he start working on that solution? Right away, of course, when everyone else stood around with their mouths open, or worse, got in his way. His wife was the worst. Great hairy bunnies, she was such an idiot. She couldn't prepare for things. She was never ready when she was meant to be. And when you got there, you could be certain she'd forgotten at least one vital thing. Like when they'd been to visit her parents. Her parents, mind you, so it wasn't like it was a treat for him. Even though he'd organised everything, she'd forgotten to bring enough food for the 3 kids. Yarg had seen the solution immediately, of course, and left her bleating about Inowak knew what while he'd made and set up the snares. Then, of course, because she'd let the kids mucker out near the snares hadn't worked, and they'd ended up eating the berries that she'd collected. She hadn't said anything, but he could tell she was thinking she'd solved the problem when she hadn't. She'd just mucked up the best solution by letting the kids go near his traps and had them eating boring berries instead of delicious rabbit. Other people, they were such tits. He knew she didn't like him changing his name from Yarg Loster to Yarg Lobster. She didn't get it. The Owsler all had clever animal names that reflected their strengths, and he was as good as the Owsler. He gripped problems like a lobster gripped its prey. It was pretty simple, for the love of bunnies. Do you mind me changing my name? He'd asked her once. What can you do? She'd said. What can I do? He'd replied. I can do anything. It wasn't just his wife. He was gallant enough to admit that she probably wasn't thicker than everybody else. He just spent more time with her, so he saw more of her stupidity. Everyone else was at least as lack-witted. None of them had the nous to realise that his solutions were always the best. Did time move more slowly for him, or was he simply blessed with being able to see how things worked and interrelated more quickly and clearly than others? One of the few mysteries he could not fathom was the source of his own genius. So, because he couldn't trust anybody else to get it right, he was leading the attack on the Badlands. Not leading, he wasn't a captain or anything like that, but he was one of the foremost warriors running towards the wall of rock. He had to be, because he would have to show everyone else how you got up a wall of rock and killed Badlanders. He wasn't sure himself yet how he was going to do it, but he knew he'd see the problem, analyse it in an instant, realise the solution and act. That was what he did. He ran on, men and women all around him. He'd never been happier. By the end of the day, they'd all owe their lives to Yarg Lobster. Finally, they'd all see him in action. Finally, they'd know. They'd toast him around the fires. Ayana would ask him to be a captain. Would he accept her request? Would he? Bunnies. And the captains were the biggest idiots of the lot of them. Yarg didn't need a title to be head of the pack. People followed him by instinct. Closer and closer they ran, and still no sign of the enemy. The Badlanders were idiots as well, surprisingly enough. A couple of sallies out from their rock wall would have put the bunnies up, most of the Calnians, not Yarg, obviously. But they were staying hidden, watching for Yarg, waiting for Yarg to work out how to kill them. They were still a couple of hundred paces from a Badland cliff when a huge section of it came tumbling down. Did a massive rock slide phase Yarg? Did it, bunnies? You'd think it might, since he'd never seen a rock slide before, but he didn't. It didn't. He'd never seen a cliff this high before either, but it was still nothing to him. "Come on, to the breach!" he shouted. Without missing a step, he altered his course to the northeast, towards the collapse. Of course, he found himself out ahead because he hadn't did it. He'd seen the problem, the cliff, and he'd seen the solution, the rock slide. Everyone else was still scratching their asses, thinking, "Oh wow, a rock slide. That's unusual. Why would a rock slide happen now? How does that affect us?" Yarg had all these thoughts and more in less than an instant, and now he was leading the way. It didn't matter that the rock slide had happened. It didn't matter that it was unlikely. It mattered that they could use it to ascend up into the Badlands. The sooner they did, the more likely they were to catch the enemy before they'd reacted to it. He got that. By Innowax bouncing bunnies, why wasn't everyone else so thick? A very weird roaring scream did slow him for half a moment. He wasn't perfect. He'd be the first to admit that. But he ran on, because he wasn't far off perfect. He'd deal with whatever caused the noise when it came to it. He didn't turn, but he knew they'd be faltering behind, which was good. They'd see him and know how much braver, how much more capable he was. There were more roaring screams. Roar! It was probably trumpets meant to scare them, meant to slow them while the Badlands defence adapted to the rock slide. That sort of bollocks wouldn't work on Yarg Lobster, no sir. Adapt quicker than Yarg? As if. Adaptation wasn't his middle name, but it should have been. He ran on towards a cloud of dust where the cliff face had been. He had to admit, got a bit of a shock when a monster the height of a tall tree ran out of it. For a moment, possibly an entire moment, he faltered. And then sped up again. He'd seen the problem, a 20-pace high monster with teeth like giant knives, and he'd seen the solution. Get under it, Yarg, he told himself. Ram your spear into its guts. How magnificent he must look, way out ahead of everyone, running towards a charging monster. It must have been 100 times his weight, more. But did it scare him? Did it, bunnies? He tossed his spear from one hand to the other, so as not to tire one arm. Might as well teach him a lesson while he had their attention. And the beast was lowering its head so that the gaping mouth was coming at him like a tooth-lined net about to scoop up a fish just a couple of feet off the ground. He saw the problem. He saw the solution. Paces away, he slid, feet first, on the slick grass. He watched the underside of the doubtlessly flummoxed beast's jaw pass overhead, and then sat up and raised his spear. He aimed the stone tip into the gigantic belly and jammed the butt into the ground. The monster's own momentum and weight would do for it, and Yarg would roll clear. Spear tip met belly. The shaft snapped in an explosion of splinters. The stone point thwonked into the ground, a handbreadth from his head. Yarg regretted not making his own spear, as an enormous talon tore into his leg. His quarry ran on. Yarg looked down at his injury. Oh, bunnies, how annoying. Because that fool weapons maker hadn't hardened his wood properly, the spear had snapped. Yarg had told him how to do it, but the idiot must have ignored his advice. The failure of the spear had distracted him, and he hadn't rolled clear as planned, and now his leg was a mess. But it didn't hurt. He could see his thigh bone. The parted flesh and muscle was oozing blood, but not gushing, so no major bloodstream had been severed. He'd live. And he wouldn't need help with the healer. He could already see how the wound should best be treated. He tried to stand. Agony lanced from his leg, and he fell back into a sitting position, facing the Badlands. 3 more monsters were coming. They were the same as the first, perhaps a little larger. The foremost of them saw him sitting there and slowed. He saw a problem. He saw a solution. He lay and rolled over, so he was face down. This was how one survived attack from humped bears, and that was the largest carnivore he'd previously come across, so he guessed the same applied here. Black bears were a different story. You fought those, but with bigger carnivores, you played dead. He heard the beast slow. He closed his eyes. He was too brave, too certain that he'd been right about playing dead to be scared. He felt teeth pierce his side, then an extraordinary strength crush his torso. Stupid animal! It was meant to sniff him and move on. He was lifted. He saw swinging grass and sky. The teeth released him and he was flying for a moment, up and then down, into the beast's hot mouth. Darkness came as his chest was squeezed. There was a moment's relief, then he was crushed again. He felt his skin split, his bones snap, his innards burst and spill. He was being chewed. Why wasn't he dead yet? As Yarg lobster became the first animal to be eaten by a lizard king in 65 million years, he cursed the spearmaker for his unhardened spear. He cursed Ayana for attacking the Badlands. He cursed his fellow soldiers for holding back, and he cursed his wife for letting him head off with the army. On that last thought, an image of his wife's smiling, bright-eyed face filled his mind, and suddenly, overwhelmingly, he realized what a dick he'd been for all his adult life. Oh, bunnies, he thought. And that is the end of the reading. That was from Land You Never Leave by me, Angus Watson, available from all good tax dodging websites. Thanks.